Wang Jian, a new bride. On the third day, she enters the kitchen and washes her hands to prepare the first soup. She doesn't know yet how her mother-in-law likes it, so she gives her husband's sister the first taste. So, continuing with the pentasyllabic quatrains, we have, just like we did yesterday, we have the first appearance of, and the first and the last appearance of a poet in this anthology, Wang Jian. So let's check some biographical information about him. So Wang Jian is basically a mid-Tang poet. He basically flourishes in the first years of the 9th century, the time of Emperor Shenzong, who led the Yuan Ho era restoration, in which the emperor managed to subdue some of those military governors who had lorded it out in the east and northeast of the country, and restore the Tang dynasty, if not to its past glory, at least to a certain degree of a centralized government and prosperity for some time again. So Wang Jiang, he was born in 766, a native of Jinchuan in Jinzhou. Around 780, he went to Heshan in Qizhou to study for the examinations, and there he would meet and become close friends with Shang Ji, who is another poet that appears in this anthology. Beginning around 785, and for the next 20 years, he served as a staff officer in several military headquarters on the frontiers. Sometime after, in 813, he moved to Weinan as district defender. There he met a eunuch named Wang Shoujiang, and through him became familiar with the lives of palace women, which resulted in a famous series of quatrains that he composed, 100 palace lyrics, which gave him a big reputation. He was famous for these poems and also for Juefu type ballads. Now, from Weinan, he later moved to the capital Chang'an as an aide in the court of the imperial treasury. By 828, he was an aide to the court of imperial sacrifices. In that year, he transferred to Shangzhou as an assistant to the prefect, but soon retired and returned to Chang'an, where he died sometime between the years 830-835. So moving on to the poem, A New Bride. This poem is part of a set of 3 that depict the first 3 days in which a married woman goes to the new house of her husband. When a woman in Tang China got married, she had to move from her family's house to her husband's father's house, and in fact she became incorporated into the family of her husband. So before commenting on the poem, a few background pieces of information about women in Tang China are perhaps relevant. I think we've already commented this. I am very fond of Confucianism, but there are aspects of Confucianism which I do not like, and one of them is its strict reinforcement of hierarchies, including family hierarchies. Confucianism generally develops a set of relations in which one is the master and the other is, if not the servant, the subordinate, who is expected to be passive and obedient, while the master is expected to be protective. Among these relations, you have the relations of ruler and ruled. There's emperor and minister. You have the relations of father and son, of elder and younger brother, and husband and wife. So the wife is supposed to be very subservient. Now, the Tang period was not the worst period for women's rights in the history of China. Even, those would become much more restricted during the Song dynasty, with the following one, with the developing of the infamous lily feet for women. And some rich and powerful women in the Tang, princesses for example, had a high degree of autonomy and power. Still, generally, women, as we said, in both state and Confucian ideology, were subordinate to husbands. They were expected to be obedient, hardworking, non-complaining, and their domain was the house, where they were supposed to weave and cook and those things. Situation of women, of a newly married woman, was even worse. So the hierarchy of man, woman, is juxtaposed on other hierarchies, like we said, that of fathers and sons. So when a man took a woman, he married a woman and he took her to his household, that woman became in effect not a slave of her husband's, but a slave of her husband's parents, especially the mother-in-law. The mother-in-law was dreaded. She had tremendous amounts of power, so much so that there are many instances, a lot of them documented, in which a mother-in-law forced a divorce between her son and his bride just because she didn't like the daughter-in-law enough, even though the husband, well, this is a famous anecdote, and it's present in, this happened to a famous writer, and even though the man was deeply in love with his wife, he had to divorce her because his mother insisted upon it. So newly married women away from their home and their relatives in a new and potentially hostile environment, they had to show that they were humble and virtuous and ready to work themselves out in the service of her newly acquired parents-in-law. Now, this information helps to give some background to this poem. So this poem, the topic of this poem is the new bride on the third day. She's preparing food for her mother-in-law, and she really wants her mother-in-law to appreciate her and to like the food. So what she does is she asks very cleverly of one of her sister-in-laws to taste it first, because she supposes the sister-in-law, having lived in that house for many years, would probably be acquainted with the tastes of her mother, and so she would be treading a safe ground here. So the poem is depicting this anecdote, and it's probably meant to highlight the smartness, the savviness of this new bride, who is clever enough to know how to try to ingratiate herself with her mother-in-law from the very first. So that's the topic of the poem. Not much really. So it depicts a funny, you could consider it funny, I imagine, anecdote of a young married woman. I don't know if it's the subject matter or maybe the translation, but it feels like a pretty dry and unpoetic poem from my perspective. Probably the one I've least liked of the whole anthology. On the other hand, it's illustrative of marriage and social customs in Tang China. Probably it also connects with the new taste for a more socially oriented type of poetry that did take place in part in the Mid-Tang, as represented by the Xin-Jue-Fu, the new Jue-Fu ballads of Bai Juji and Yuan Chen, and also of Chang Jian, and this idea of the Neo-Confucians, of the Kuwen, of the old style prose movement that flourished in this period. Anyway, let's take a look at the poem couplet by couplet. First couplet. On the third day, she enters the kitchen and washes her hands to prepare the first soup. So not much in the in complexity or in imagery here. This could be perfectly prosaic. It's the third day of the marriage. One of the obligations after the third day has come for the prospective newly incorporated family member, the new young wife. One of her obligations is to dirty her hands preparing food for her in-laws. So she enters the kitchen. It's the third day. She washes her hands. She's going to prepare the first soup she prepares in this house. Second couplet. So now we have a slight conundrum and the solution of the conundrum. She doesn't know yet how her mother-in-law likes it. So she gives her husband's sister the first taste. So she has this first dilemma. I haven't lived in this house, so I really don't know how they take the soup here. Do they like it more spicy or more sweet or a little bit sour or more salty or whatever? So I will make use of my husband's sister. So she could have asked her husband perhaps, but probably that would not have been completely proper under rigid Confucian standards. And her husband's sister probably also moves around the kitchen, so she would have been accessible. And asking her to taste it, she gets probably a very good piece of evidence on if the soup is in the flavor or in the taste that they are accustomed to in her husband's household. And that's all. So a pretty simple poem. I won't say I dislike it, but I would be sincere in saying that it's probably the less inspiring poem of the anthology, although probably it would satisfy the pedagogical purposes of this anthology, of showing, how you can make a poem about a very domestic and everyday subject, a very simple poem about, a family custom.